Hi guys, Goose here, and in this video we're going to be looking at the history of Brian May's effects pedals. Okay guys, the first effect we're going to talk about is the treble booster. So Brian May used the OC44 germanium transistor based Dallas Rangemaster treble booster pedal from the late 1960s up to the Queen tours in mid to late 1973. Brian bought his first Rangemaster second hand and used it to record the first Queen album from June until November 1972. Live, he used the Rangemaster around the time of the release of the first album in July 1973. The treble booster is a very simple battery-powered device to boost the guitar signal, and a simple network of resistors and capacitors to shape the sound and give it the right frequency balance. The Rangemaster was used by Brian on Queen recordings, Queen 1, Queen 2 and A Night at the Opera. The Rangemaster is perhaps the most famous of all the treble boosters produced. It employed a germanium transistor and it has a distinctive raw metallic sound similar to that produced by a half-cocked wah pedal. Although not as full sounding as the Cornish or Friar boosters, it's actually able to produce the same output boost level, which is around 25 dB. You can really hear the boost effect on the opening of Sweet Lady, Great King Rat and Brighton Rock. Brian used the OC44 germanium transistor based Dallas Rangemaster treble booster pedal from the late 1960s up to the Queen tours in mid to late 1973. Brian bought his first Rangemaster second hand and he used it to record the first Queen album from June to November 1972. The following album, Queen 2, was recorded in 1973, and Brian's guitar tone seemed a little bit similar to the first album, although it was also different and sounded a bit plush and richer and heavier, as opposed to the rather cleaner sound of his guitar from the first Queen album. It could be that he was using a slightly different treble booster, and lots of other variables such as his amplifier and the tubes and the mic positions as well would come into factor. Brian's Rangemaster pedal was lost around mid to late 1973, and it's quite possible that Brian used this original Rangemaster treble booster to record both the Queen and Queen 2 albums. Brian told guitar tech Greg Fryer in 1998 that the Rangemaster booster was left behind at a gig by a roadie and lost. When Brian asked the roadie where the treble booster was and learned that it had been left behind at the previous gig, the roadie then apparently said, "Oh, I didn't think it did very much." This seems likely to have occurred around mid to late 1973. As is obvious, the treble booster was a critical part of Brian's sound, and he needed to replace this as soon as possible. Obviously, the Dallas Rangemaster had been out of production for many years, and it would have been difficult for Brian to locate one. Brian's father, Harold, then came to the rescue and made him another treble booster similar to the Rangemaster. Brian and Harold had the circuit for the Rangemaster drawn out prior to this time, and both Brian and Greg still have copies of this original hand-drawn diagram, which was kept with the original Red Special plans. And here you can see Brian in 1974 with the Harold May treble booster pedal and a Gen wah-wah pedal. And here's a close-up in 1974 of the Harold May treble booster. One thing to bear in mind that it's also possible that John Deacon, who was an electronics graduate, could also have made the replacement for the lost Rangemaster. This booster may have used the same germanium transistor as the Rangemaster, or it could have used the newer, cheaper NPN silicon transistors available at the time, such as the BC547 or the BC238. Both Harold May and John Deacon possessed the electronic knowledge and experience to be able to make such a treble booster for Brian. Or they could have adapted different versions of the treble booster if Brian so required it. Pete Cornish made many treble boosters for Brian May, and the first ones he made were in 1975. Pete told Mark Reynolds that the first treble booster of Brian May's that he examined in 1975 had been made by John Deacon, and that it used a silicon transistor. In this article published in 1993 in UK Guitar Magazine, we can see that Pete Cornish stated that it was actually in fact John Deacon who made the treble booster originally for Brian. Regardless of who made it, it was very likely that the silicon transistor booster that Pete Cornish examined in 1975 was the one that was used on the Queen album Sheer Heart Attack. And you can hear the slightly different tone that this silicon transistor treble booster would have brought to Brian's live and recorded sound with Queen. In 1998, whilst working at Brian's London Allerton Hill studio, guitar tech Greg Fryer interviewed John Deacon about the origins of the legendary Deaky amp, and he also asked John if he had made the first treble boosters for Brian at that time, as John was studying for an electronics degree when he first joined Queen in 1972. John told Greg that he did not make the treble booster for Brian, and said that Brian had other people doing that for him. Now it could be, guys, that John Deacon actually forgot that he'd made the treble booster for Brian. Due to the sands of time, Brian has actually forgotten a lot of what happened, but he did say that his father Harold had made a number of treble boosters. So who exactly made that treble booster we'll probably never know. Greg Fryer states, "It is my opinion that the treble booster, which Brian May used for the recording of Sheer Heart Attack from July to September 1974, heralded the golden era of his sound with Queen, which began in mid to late 1974 and continued through the rest of the 1970s. I believe that Brian's rich, lush sounds, as heard on masterpieces such as Killer Queen and other songs from the album, are unlikely to have been produced using a germanium transistor Rangemaster style treble booster. It is highly likely that the treble booster which Brian used on Sheer Heart Attack had an NPN silicon transistor, such as the BC548 or the BC238. And here is a great photo of Freddie and Brian in London at the Imperial College on November the 2nd, 1973. We can clearly see a switcher for the Echoplex, a Yen wah, and also the handmade treble booster. The wah pedal was an Italian Gen Crybaby unit. From 1974, Brian May's very simple guitar pedal setup was then moved on a little bit. We can see that from 1974, Brian May actually had a pedal board. Although it was simple, it contained a treble booster and wah, and these were mounted on a long plywood base. The wah-wah was mounted high off the plywood base, possibly on a block of wood, and there were two Echoplex foot switches on the board also. Richard Ball Jones captured Brian May's pedalboard in a photograph taken of Freddie on stage at London's Rainbow Theatre on 20th of November 1974. The Harold May or John Deacon treble booster can be clearly seen placed next to Brian's Gen wah-wah. It's also seen along with one of the Echoplex foot switches for the single delay. And obviously, the treble booster pictured is a different shape and colour to a Dallas Rangemaster. These photos are from Queen's tour of Japan in 1976. The photos were taken by Bob Wegner, and we can clearly see his pedalboard in these photos. Mark Reynolds says, Pete Cornish first started doing electronic work for Brian May in 1975. Pete was called in to help Brian with his gear because he was getting bad noise issues during rehearsals. Outside the place they were rehearsing was a giant radio mast, and this was the cause of radio frequency noise problem. I asked Pete what treble booster Brian was using at the time he first met him and what germanium transistor was in the booster. Pete told me very specifically that Brian was not using a germanium transistor treble booster at that time. And Pete said it was a silicon transistor booster made by John Deacon. He was very adamant about that fact. Pete said the booster was very crudely made, and this may partly explain why the unit was prone to picking up radio frequency noise. Pete Cornish went away and made a new treble booster for Brian, which was designed to filter out the RF noise, which had been a big problem for Brian. He said when he returned it, Brian said that the treble booster was not powerful enough. Pete then came back with a BC149 treble booster, which Brian used from then on. He also provided Brian's roadie with a box full of Cornish humbuster units, because Brian's guitar pedal amp rig was very noisy, and he also supplied some ground lift switches in these units, which remove the hum issues between the amplifiers. Pete said Brian's roadies weren't too pleased with him because they had to insert the humbuster units between a number of Brian's leads, along with all the other things they had to do. I have never really found out what Brian was using prior to Pete Cornish getting involved with regard to preventing earth loop hum, which happens when you use several guitar amps together. Regarding the treble booster with the extra plus 15 dB preamp, which was on all the time driving the guitar audio signal. The plus 15 dB preamp is a clean boost and didn't add any distortion to the audio signal. Pete stated that it was there because the massive cable runs from the guitar to the pedal board and from the pedal board to the amps caused a loss of audio signal, and the signal ended up not being strong enough to drive the amplifiers to the desired level by using the treble booster signal alone. So the plus 15 dB preamp was added to help compensate for the loss of signal due to the long cable runs. Shortly after this, Brian adopted the BC149 booster and 2 separate TB Extra boxes taped together. So then the pedal board went guitar, treble booster BC149, to the TB Extra, then the Fox phaser, and then to the Vox AC30 amplifiers. The preamp and clean boost then disappeared from the board. It could have been that Pete Cornish might have built something else off stage to help raise the guitar signal by that time. You can see the duplex pedal, which was basically 2 treble booster extras in one box, in December 1977 on the Bob Harris show when Queen were playing We Are the Champions. The older duplexes were 2 separate boosters. They were not internally linked. Pete Cornish's modern duplex has 1 input and 1 output as a dual switch booster unit. They are not the same as the vintage ones, which had 2 separate boosters. You can see here in the late 1970s Brian May using his black plywood pedal board. On this pedal board, the signal flow was as follows: the guitar, the BC149 treble booster, the treble booster extra duplex, the Fox phaser, and then to the AC30s. This board was actually used right up until 1982. It last appeared live with Queen in England at Milton Keynes on the 5th of June 1982. And at that time, Brian had also begun to use a Boss CE1 chorus pedal. The Boss CE1 can also be seen at the side of the black plywood pedal board in the Milton Keynes concert video footage. Shortly after June 1982, the plywood pedal board was given to Pete Cornish, and Pete Cornish was asked to use the component parts and make Brian's new pedal board more roadworthy. The pedal board, which was dated by Pete Cornish, was July 1982, serial number 076. After all this effort, apparently Brian preferred the sound of his earlier and more simple plywood pedal board. Apparently Brian said that Pete Cornish had added new things to the circuit, such as level matching buffers, etc., that Brian May actually disliked. And it was also more difficult for him to use compared to the older pedal board, which he was very familiar with. The consensus was that the larger pedal board did not sound good, but that the main problem that Brian May encountered was regarding the ergonomics of it. The new pedal board was a larger rectangular size and had foot switches that Brian couldn't easily find with his foot on a dark stage, often with smoke effects obscuring his vision. And take note that also Brian May would wear clogs as shoes. And it was very important for Brian at this professional level to be able to use his pedal board very easily and automatically with split second timing on a darkened stage. But it was obviously too late to do anything about it, and Brian May was stuck with the new pedal board and just had to make the best of it. The large 1982 Pete Cornish pedal board was opened and examined by Nigel Knight and Pete Maladrone. Pete Cornish had literally taken all of the earlier plywood pedal board parts and fitted them into a larger pedal board system that he had made, along with extra things such as level matchers and buffers. The 2 booster circuits in the larger pedal board were the BC149 circuits, and you can see these clearly in these photos. According to Pete Cornish, the standalone treble booster pedals that he supplied Brian in the mid-1980s were hotter than the original ones, and these included some twin transistor boosters such as the one pictured. He also made a lower powered single transistor, a BC182L circuit. Pete also made Brian some boosters with the BC182L transistor. Pete Cornish said that these BC182L boosters were Friday afternoon boosters that Brian needed urgently, and that he did not have the original transistors available, so had to use these transistors as a substitute. Greg Fryer said in July 1996 that the treble boosters made by Pete Cornish were Brian's favourite treble boosters and were the ones that he preferred using for recording live. It's worth noting that Brian May's favourite version of Pete's treble booster, which we'll call a TB83 as it was made in 1983, has a 10 nanofarad capacitor at the input, whereas the originals had a 4.7 nanofarad capacitor, which was the same as a Rangemaster original. Also, Pete's modern TB83 appears to have been using a hotter and thicker sounding transistor compared to the original single transistor treble boosters that he made for Brian in the 1970s and 1980s. From the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, Brian used his live stage rig treble boosters made by Pete Cornish, which were twin transistor units similar to the Guild treble booster circuit. These twin transistor treble boosters were considerably more powerful than the single transistor BC149 or the BC182L treble boosters, and were foot switchable with the circuitry housed in a large box. These boosters sometimes used the BC239C or the Z-Tex equivalent transistors. Pete Cornish's involvement with Queen started in 1972. His first commission from Queen was to eliminate the ground loop hum caused by the interconnection of 3 Vox AC30 amps and 2 modified Echoplex EP3 delays. In January 1972, he designed and built special circuitry to isolate the amps and echoes, which successfully eliminated all the hum problems. Reportedly, he used to extend his old Echoplex's head travel considerably to get longer delays. In June 1982, Pete was requested to build an integrated system for Brian May's stage setup, with the majority of the wiring permanently installed in order to reduce the rigging time. The system comprised of a footboard connected to a main routing unit via a 25M multi-core cable. The AC power for the amplifiers, the routing system and the echoes needed to be stabilised at a constant voltage. At this time, Brian's stage setup now consisted of 12 AC30 amps and 2 MXR DDL2 delays fed from a power isolation transformer, plus the remote footboard, which Brian operated on stage. Brian says of mixing guitar effects such as chorus and delays, "The problem with guitar effects like chorus and delays is that they add a time-shifted or delayed version of your signal, and in a certain way they disturb the original sound if played in the same couple of speakers. Indeed, the frequency extension of a delayed note is exactly the same, and this way the cone of an amp is still moving, reproducing the original signal, and then he has to reproduce the delayed line too. This kind of mixing is not the best one. The best one is to let the air be your mixer." So Brian's advice is to use a second amp to reproduce the chorus version of his guitar playing, a third one for the first delay output, and a fourth one for the second delay output, etc. In the 1982 Pete Cornish designed pedalboard, a modified Fox phaser pedal was added with a foot-operated speed controller. Other modifications were as follows. The potentiometer was fitted into a Crybaby chassis, as the original speed control pedal was badly worn, along with a replacement heavy-duty bypass switch. The original Fox circuit board was too large to fit into the Crybaby chassis, so Pete incorporated it into the pedal board with a built-in 9-volt DC power supply. He did not do any audio modifications to it. The Roland Boss CE1 chorus ensemble was stripped down and the circuit board with modifications was fitted into the pedal board. Pete's modifications involved level matching so as to allow the treble boost signal to pass through it unattenuated. The Eventide harmonizer foot controller was also added. The pedalboard had built-in foot switches and outputs to a remote rack unit. Okay guys, let's talk a little bit about the Guild Brian May treble booster pedals. Guild made these pedals firstly in the mid-1980s, and Brian himself actually used one in a music video. The original Brian May Guild pedal was, as you can see, a red colour pedal with 2 knobs which were gain and intensity and a foot switch. And on this circuit board you can see the silicon transistor. Guild named this pedal a power booster, but the circuit is basically identical to a treble booster. This pedal featured a 4.7 nanofarad input cap. And essentially this is a Pete Cornish TB83 treble booster clone. One thing to note is this is a battery only pedal. In the 1990s, Guild released the Brian May pedal. This is also referred as the BHM2 pedal. The pedal case is left unpainted with just the text printed on it. And apparently the intention was that it looked handmade. Now apparently in the 90s, Brian May actually took his treble booster pedal to Guild and so that they could make a direct clone of it. This is pretty close to the Pete Cornish pedal Brian May took to Guild. We can see in this pedal that it actually has 2 silicon transistors. This pedal features 2 NPN transistors. The model name is MPS 1898. Just looking at the schematic here, guys, we've got a 1 meg pull down resistor which emits the sort of pop that you get from turning the pedal on and off. After this we've got a 100 nanofarad input cap, so slightly different from the previous 80s version of the Guild treble booster. In the 1990s, Brian was using a Zoom 1982 strap mountable multi-effects unit. He said of these in a December 92 Guitarist magazine interview, "I've tried most of the guitar synths and stuff, but I just prefer my instruments. It's very human and it makes the right noise. I do play through Zoom boxes these days, which I enjoy. I think they're a good little piece of apparatus. They're good for each end of the spectrum, for the full-blown solo or for clean rhythm. The only thing perhaps they don't handle is that intermediate area, which the AC30 is very good at, where you can strike a chord and it's distorted, but you can still hear what the chord is." Let's have a look at Brian's current guitar touring rig. So looking at this setup, the guitar signal goes first into the Cat treble booster and then to a Sennheiser SK500 transmitter, both of which are mounted on the strap. It arrives via some aerials and goes straight into the Sennheiser receiver, an EW500G2, and from there it goes into a custom splitter designed by Mike Hill. The main signal then goes through a Dunlop rack mount wah, a Crybaby DCR2SR. And then it's split further 2 ways. One of the signals goes straight into the center amp and the other to the effects loop, of which there are 2. These loops go separately to the TC Electronic G Major 2 boxes. One is acting as a spare. Also included in the main splitter are a D key out, a tuner out, plus there is a controller board which his guitar tech is able to control all of this setup with. This allows the guitar tech to route the signal to either all 3 AC30s or just the 2 outside AC30s or the center AC30 only or the D key. The tuner is a Korg pitch black which is permanently on and it sits on the side fill by his guitar rack. And here we can see a Digitech Brian May pedal which is used for the Tie Your Mother Down song. When he plays the side solo, he normally switches to another pickup setting, but he's always struggled to pick up the slide out of his strap, set the pickups right and hit the note at the start. So now using the Digitech, Brian has a Tie Your Mother Down solo setting on this. At the bottom of the rack is a Kukusi PCR1000M, which sets the voltage for the whole rig, including the amplifiers. Everything is set at 230 volts, which the AC30s were designed to run at. It also keeps the rig running at 60 Hz rather than 50, which really helps in the reliability of the amplifiers. The Cat STB unit was originally designed for Brian for use in conjunction with his strap-mounted radio transmitter system, and it has a 4.7 nanofarad input cap. Thank you for watching this video and thank you very much for the comments. I do read them all. Until the next video, take care guys. This is Goose signing out.